مشارکت در صلح، چگونه اقتصادهای جهانی میتوانند به دنیای پر از مخاصمۀ امروز شکل بدهند. در شرایطی که در دنیای امروز به نظر میرسه که بیزنس ها و کمپانی های بزرگ جهانی نقش بزرگی در ایجاد یا کاهش مخاصمات جهانی دارند، به نظر میرسه که با چالش های جدید نوظهور و رو به رشد دنیای امروز اقتصادهای جهانی و کمپانی های بزرگ چاره جز این ندارند که خودشون رو تطبیق بدن برای کمک به کاهش یا از بین بردن مناقشات منطقه‌ای و بین‌المللی. خانم دکتر مری مارتین میهمان امروز ما در کتابی که اخیراً منتشر کرده این موضوع مورد بررسی قرار داده که چگونه با توجه به سابقه پیشینه کمپانی‌های بزرگ جهانی در ایجاد یا گسترش تنش‌های منطقه‌ای و بین‌المللی باید و می‌توانند کمک کنند به کاهش تنش‌ها و درگیری‌های جهانی و زمینی که خودشون هم از این کاهش تنش بهره میبرند به دنیا هم تو این زمینه کمک کنند. در واقع بحثی که ایشون با مقالات متعددی که تو این کتاب دارن اینه که در واقع برخلاف نگاه کوتاه مدتی که این کمپانی‌ها داشتن و صرفاً به سود خود فکر می‌کردن، امروزه میتونن ضمن توجه به سودشون و درآمدزایی با یک نگاه راهبردی شریک بشن در رفع یا کاهش مشکلات جهانی و در واقع به نوع امنیت انسانی رو تضمین بکنن در مناقشاتی که در دنیا هست و خودشون هم از این امنیت انسانی بهره مند بشن. مری مارتین کسیه که از بک‌گراند روزنامه‌نگاری از روزنامه‌ها و رسانه‌های بزرگ جهانی اومده به دانشگاه و در دانشگاه در واقع تلفیقی از این نگاه رو برای استفاده مخاطب عام و خاص در واقع عرضه میکنه در مؤسسه اندیشه‌های دانشگاه استاد و سیاست لندن. Dr. Martin, thank you very much for accepting our invitation for this interview. I would like to ask my first question about your background, your previous work and jobs and your position here. Thank you.
Majid, thank you for asking me. So I suppose I've had three phases to my career. I started off as a journalist in newspapers, which I spent 20 years in various UK publications in the area of financial business journalism and then as a foreign correspondent. And then I worked in the private sector on strategic communications. I then did a PhD at Cambridge in international relations, which allowed me to pick up the third strand, which has been in academia here at LSE.
You said about journalism, and when I read your bio and your CV, you were working for both Guardian and Daily Telegraph, very contradictory papers. I mean, at least to ordinary people, they cannot be sleep in the same bed. Can you tell us how did you manage to work for both of them?
It's true, and actually before that I worked on before The Guardian I worked on two other papers which were more sort of right-wing leaning, let's say the Daily Express, and before that the Evening Standard. So clearly the politics were very different, but of course the skill set is the same. You need to be able to write clearly, to as it were sell a story and entertain and inform readers. So in that there was no difference. My brief at the Telegraph and before that the Guardian was very much to do with Europe and the European Union. And of course on that subject the Guardian and the Telegraph had very different political views. One reason I took the Telegraph job was it was a bit of a challenge really to try and explain and increase the understanding of readers about Europe and towards the European Union. I don't know if I did that. We obviously ended up after my time with the Brexit vote, but it was an enormously rewarding kind of area to be writing about.
Obviously you moved from the media to academia. how did you find this transition, and is it something you desired, or it just happened?
I very much desired. I found myself at a moment in my career. I was in daily journalism, and that takes quite a toll after a while, you know, late nights, and I had a family. I had a young family at the time. So it was an opportunity came up to pause, and that's when I did my PhD in Cambridge. I think the difference is that the immediate change that I noticed between journalism and academia was I had time. As an academic, I had time and the luxury of going deeper into subjects. If you work on daily newspapers, the deadline is all. You have to get something done by, say, 9 o'clock at night, or perhaps even earlier. When I was a correspondent in the US, I was having to finish stories by 2 in the afternoon. And that doesn't allow you to go into much depth. So the luxury, if you like, of being an academic is to really pursue something much more rigorously. But again, the skill sets are not that different. The ability to investigate, to write clearly, I think that's what journalism helped me in moving into academia. And I do think that academics need to respect deadlines, which often they don't. And I try to do that.
I mean, I think the new era of academia doesn't allow you to work in one book for whole life, and it used to be a fashion, but not at the moment is a weakness.
Yes, that's true. I mean, we've become more transient in academia, but I suppose where I sit as a research fellow, I'm at that sort of bridging point between pure theoretical research. Mine is very much applied, it's very policy focused. So again, I'm talking to the same kind of audiences, amongst government officials, NGOs, as well as students and academia per se. So I'm trying to get my messages across just in a slightly different depth and way.
I remember, say, 30 years ago, when you work in one book for whole life, or when you had your PhD thesis in say 300,000 words, that was very prestigious.
Yes.
But now is not a good thing, and maybe you'll be refused if you work without time management and working in too many words, more than 150,000.
It's true, in the general context, the public appetite for information, we've all got much shorter attention spans. So in a sense, one has to go with that trend. You're competing, whether you're a journalist or you're an academic, you're competing for attention and, to say that my topic is important. So I think you need to keep that in mind and not get too much in the details, where you lose people.
Publish or perish.
Publish or perish, absolutely, that too.
Your current position is the Director of UN Business and Human Security at the LSE IDEAS. Can you tell us about the title of your position, UN Business and Human Security? Define it for the audience. What do you mean about that?
Well, let me give you a bit of background. Yes. I started this project about 5 years ago. I'd been working with colleagues in the area of human security, and I'm sure we'll come on to talking about what human security is. But I'd looked at it in terms of security after the Cold War, how that had changed, and different ideas and practices of security. And mostly we were researching and we were addressing audiences that included diplomats, but military, policymakers and so on. And from what I've told you of my previous background, I was curious because business and the private sector didn't seem to be part of that conversation, and I thought that was missing, an element that was missing. So it happened I was giving a lecture in Turkey outlining some of these ideas, and somebody from the UN was in the audience, and they said, you know, we would like to think about doing a project with you on this conjunction of human security in business. Is this a concept that business could use? And equally, is human security something that needs to involve the private sector, not just military people or diplomats or policymakers or even NGOs? So that's where it started, and we've been going now for, say, about 4 or 5 years, and really trying to demonstrate that proposition. Is there a value added?
So, as a student, if I ask you what is exactly the meaning of human security, especially in combination with business, can you tell us what you think about that?
So I think the easiest way of thinking about human security is in contrast to what we traditionally understood as security as a government policy, policies of government. And then it was about making sure that territory and countries were protected from foreign invasion. So the kind of tools of security are armies and weaponry and so on. And human security is an idea that the UN came up with in 1994 in the wake of the end of the Cold War. And really it's about thinking of security in terms of people's everyday lives. It's focused on people, on individuals, on communities, and on their lived experiences. So what they need to be safe, the kind of threats they face, and that can range from hunger, lack of jobs, bad environment, pollution, no clean water, lack of education. The combination of those threats is going to be different from one person to another, from one area to another. So it's a very local, bottom-up approach to security, rather than, again, the kind of top-down policies that we used to see before the end of the Cold War, and kind of military strategies and geopolitics. So if you like, to take an example, I worked on for a long time in the context of, say, the War on Terror. War on Terror was very much about mobilizing military force, but also state interventions and state building. Human security is about, sometimes I often call it the worm's eye view. What's happening on the ground? How can we make people safe and their everyday lives better, as a route to global stability and prosperity?
Another aspect, good aspect in your book is I found each chapter as a separate subject. You can read it separately, but all together tells the same story, one story, and each of the stories have different tale for itself. So you can either have each of them separately, and you can go through all of them as a one topic and one idea.
That's true. I think you can read the chapters individually, but there's also, I hope, a sense that the narrative builds through the book. I think where I come at this challenge, this academic, intellectual challenge, is that we tend to regard companies as kind of separate entities. This is a legacy of, years, decades of neoliberalism. Usually I start a lecture on this by putting up different quotes from different eras. So in 1970, you have Milton Friedman, the arch kind of neoliberal economist, saying that the only social purpose of business is business. Business is there to make a profit. If you fast forward to 2020, you have Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, one of the world's biggest investors, saying that companies have to make a contribution to the social environment. That's their way to win not just the support of their customers, their employees, but ultimately to make a profit. Now, in that arc from 1970 to 2020, a lot is going on.
Half a century.
And I think the chapters in the book hopefully tell different aspects of how businesses are behaving in different ways, but also how they could behave. I tried to show that trajectory and show that there are ways in which business interacts with society at the grassroots, at ground level, which opens up the possibilities, opens our eyes to a different way of imagining two things, both corporate responsibility, how businesses should behave, but also peace and societal challenges as well, how we achieve those.
You talked about conflicts and cooperation. As you explained, from Friedman till now, there are lots of ups and downs about this idea. How can you talk about these two things? What is your perception about conflict and cooperation? Is it possible to try to convince the global business about working about cooperation to combat the conflicts?
Yes, I think several things in that question, if you like, because what do we mean by conflict? I mean, clearly there's armed conflict, and when you talk to a lot of businesses and companies, they say, well, we're not in conflict areas, we're not in Syria, we're not in we're not even in DRC or the Balkans or whatever. But actually, because global supply chains and value chains are so extended nowadays, it's almost impossible for a large company, and mostly in this book I'm talking about big transnational corporations.
You cannot say it's nothing to do with me. I try to look at the issue from the third world or developing countries, scholars. They might think about the issue that your vision about the global businesses, their intention to help to solve the problems or help to solve the conflicts in the world, this is too positive and too naive, forgive my language. But maybe the idea, their dark vision about global business are not acceptable, but I think it's understandable.
It's very understandable. We don't come at this with a clean slate. There's clearly been a history of abuses of corporate power everywhere. I mean, one of the early kind of scandals in all this was what Shell, the oil company, did in the Niger Delta. In persecuting local people in pursuit of profit and power. I think we have come a long way since then, but that dark vision clearly still persists, and I think if you talk to civil society, NGOs, and even my own colleagues within LSE and other academic institutions, if you work in development studies, you generally have a rather cynical, certainly skeptical view of business and the dark side. But so I think it's actually what business needs to do is to build trust, to rebuild trust. And we get mixed messages on that. I mean, if you look at the COVID pandemic, we've done some work on looking at initiatives by companies to work with communities to address some of the problems raised by the pandemic. And a very mixed picture. In some places, companies are regarded as the only competent people who can help. And a lot of the most fragile and vulnerable areas, we're talking about governments who simply aren't present on the ground, don't have the capacity or will. And in that situation, it's companies that a lot of people look to have the resources and the skills to address problems. So I think that's what's important in thinking about what do we mean by our relationship towards business. To going back to your point, it's more grey than black and white.
Exactly. If I want to continue the previous question, I would like to go to the chapter 6 of your book. It's titled Going Off the Rail in Jerusalem. It's mainly on Israeli-Palestinians conflict. This question is linked between the Western governments and the Western businesses, major businesses. They both claim we are trying to help to solve this problem. This is one of the most important ongoing conflicts in the world. But what we can see here in their vision and their action in Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that they say we are the honest peace broker in that area, but at the same time they say we have strategic and non-breakable relation with one side. So this is the vision and perception of people in Israel and Palestine about the genuine effort of the Western governments and Western businesses to solve this problem. How do you think we can solve this paradoxical situation?
Well, listen, the Palestinian situation is probably the hard problem, to coin a phrase, in international politics. And if you add business into the mix, it possibly makes it even more complicated. I think the reason I wanted to include the story in chapter 6, which is about two French companies who won a contract to build the Jerusalem Light Railway, which connects settlements, illegal settlements in the Palestinian territories, in the occupied territories.
اینجا در نیوزیلند، کیلومترها دورتر از فلسطین، معترضان به شرکت وگوی مقابل دفتر این شرکت تظاهرات کردند. اعتراض به ساخت راه آهن در فلسطین اشغالی توسط این شرکت عمرانی چند ملیتی با مرکزیت فرانسه. در فوریه 2011 شورای یکی از محلات لندن پس از اعلام اینکه فعالیت‌های شرکت وگوی برای رژیم صهیونیستی به ستم مستمر بر مردم فلسطین کمک کرده است، به بازنگری موضع خود با این شرکت و عدم انعقاد قرارداد جدید با آن رأی داد. در همان سال کمیسیون عدالت و صلح کلیسای کاتولیک در انگلستان از شهرداری‌های لندن خواست تا تجارت با وگوی را به دلیل دخالت آن در شهرک‌سازی‌های غیرقانونی متوقف کند. معاون اجرایی ارشد وگوی در مصاحبه‌ای در سال 2012 با مطبوعات صهیونیستی اعتراف کرد که وگوی از سوی گروه‌های طرفدار فلسطین در اروپا به ویژه بر سر راه آهن اورشلیم تحت فشار است. اما او قصد وگوی برای ماندن در سرزمین‌های فلسطینی اشغالی را تایید کرد. تظاهرات و اعتراضات ادامه پیدا کرد تا جایی که حتی ترانه‌هایی برای این جنبش ساخته شد. فشارها تا حدی افزایش یافت که در اول آوریل 2015 این شرکت در وبسایت خود اعلام کرد وگوی فروش فعالیت‌های خود را در اسرائیل متوقف می‌کند. ماجرای شرکت وگوی نمونه موفقی از دستاوردهای جنبش بایکوت اسرائیل بوده است.
I think for me, one of the lessons of that episode was unintended consequences, that businesses can blunder into very complicated geopolitical, strategic dilemmas. I think Vegoolia honestly did not realize what it was getting into. Now, it should have done. And again, this goes back to my point about there's often a disconnect between the top of a company and what goes on the ground. You know, sorting that contract, winning that contract was left to sort of a local technical manager, if you like, without really foreseeing all the strategic and political consequences of it. I do think there is, as I say, an enormous largely untapped potential for business to be a proactive, positive social and political actor. In the context of the occupied territories, that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think generally the feeling is that any business that operates in the occupied territories shouldn't be there because it's effectively favouring one side over the other. But my reason for including it in the book was just to show the many different forces that are at play, and it's not an easy role for business to adopt, to be this social, political, peace-building actor, particularly when it doesn't realise what it's getting itself into.
Following to my previous questions about chapter 6 of your book, you quoted from Omar Barghouthi, the Palestinian politician and activist, based on his interview with the Financial Times. I quote, "We are winning the battle of minds and hearts across the world despite Israel's still homogenic influence among governments in the US and Europe." Obviously, it is a very hectic and sensitive issue, the Israeli-Palestinian, especially in academia. It's very sensitive issue, and you don't want to go to detail of that, but you skillfully managed to talk about this issue, that although one side can win the battle, but the on-the-ground battle, but in the battle of minds and hearts, you can be a loser. And we can see in this world, despite lots of winning by Israelis in the different wars, in terms of media and media opinion and public opinion and even politicians and elites, this is not a very pleasant situation for Israel, and you touched that. Can you talk about that, and what is a relation to the global business? Because at the end of the day, your book is about global business, but you touched this important topic and you managed to relate that to the global business.
What I thought was fascinating about the whole story of the Jerusalem Light Railway that I tried to tell in chapter 6 was that there was this very active civil society campaign, Stop the Wall and the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement that Omar Barghouthi led. And it was enormously successful, and it was successful in a commercial sense, in that it caused immense damage to the companies involved, because the idea that what they were doing in a place where perhaps naively and wrongly they thought that nobody was really looking or paying attention, but suddenly the NGO campaign was having repercussions in very lucrative markets for them in Western Europe. So the boycott campaign, which targeted travellers on railways going into London, or public health contracts in Sweden. It brought the Israel-Arab conflict home to customers, consumers, media and employees far beyond the Palestinian territories. So apart from this chapter in the book, I've done other work with colleagues in comparing that civil society approach, the activist campaign, to other measures which were legal, which were going on at the same time, to try and hold the companies to account. And also the legal campaign was interesting in that it tried to establish a connection between the French government and its position on the Palestinian territories and what the companies were doing. Ultimately, the legal campaign really didn't succeed. It certainly didn't have the impact that the NGO, the activist campaign did. And I think that has enormous repercussions for business. It really brings home to business that it cannot act with impunity, even in areas where it thinks and in ways that it thinks won't attract attention, because it does.
You also have a section on Balkan. And about the Balkan, your approach is highly based on the political economic facts. But there are also other facts, like sectarian facts in this region that affect the business and economics as well. And can you tell us what is your thought about the sectarian element in this conflict?
I think what we still have in a sense in former Yugoslavia was a triple crisis. There was the collapse of communism, there was the collapse of the economy, and then there was the nationalism, sectarian divides, the ethnic divisions. And I think that still goes on, but in order to rebuild society, to move on beyond the 90s and to make successful societies and economies in that region, you need, it's not the only thing, but you do need vibrant economies. I mean, the economic problem had to be addressed. What I was really interested in looking at the situation in the Balkans, and mostly I looked at Fiat in Serbia, but also I've done a lot of work in Kosovo, which is a much less developed economy, and in a way, if it was more developed, if there was more investment, if there was more outside engagement by business rather than just, you know, state builders and international politicians, maybe that would help, you know, the situation normalize. But I think what was again interesting for me, rather like the chapter in the Middle East, was that Fiat, you know, a household name, global company, has enormous resources and skill and experience in going into underdeveloped economies and you know, bringing in car manufacturing to have all sorts of effects, mostly economic. Again, like Veolia, they didn't really understand what they were stepping into, that there was a much deeper issue and set of challenges, some of them around the sectarian divides, but more generally around the fragility of local society, not just an economic fragility, but a social fragility.
It's interesting to me, your thinking about the solving the conflict beyond the sectarianism or different political differences. But when you talk about other region, you can find some paradoxical points or something, if you can, I can call it double standard or that. For example, on the subject of Georgia, when you talked about the pipelines, I quote from your book, you said the West provides a security blanket for countries along the route of the pipeline against the aggression from powerful neighbors such as Russia and Iran, guaranteed to market for the region's oil, which contributes to their economic and political stability. As you can see, for example, in the ongoing saga of energy pipelines from Southern Caucasus or Central Asia to Europe, this is at least in the last 35 years, that it's always try to divert or isolate Iran from that, and especially in the project called Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, if you know Ceyhan, you know that. And that in this situation, everyone knows the shortest way, safest way, cheapest way is from Iran. But they even tried to use Afghanistan on the Taliban, previous Taliban, even harder than, but avoid Iran or ignore Iran.
این قطرات سیاه در بندر شهر جیهان ترکیه نفت خام است. نفت خامی که از لوله‌ای طولانی به درازای 1800 کیلومتر از باکو آغاز شده، از گرجستان و تفلیس گذشته و به ترکیه رسیده است تا به کشورهای مختلف صادر شود. کشور آذربایجان بعد از استقلال از اتحاد جماهیر شوروی نیاز شدیدی به صادرات نفت خام برای پیشرفت اقتصادی داشت. 3 مسیر پیش روی این کشور بود: صادرات از طریق ایران و خلیج فارس، صادرات از طریق روسیه و صادرات از طریق ترکیه. آذربایجان با کمک کشورهای غربی تصمیم گرفت مسیر طولانی ترکیه را بر ایران ترجیح دهد و باز هم به دلیل خصومت با ارمنستان مسیر خط لوله را طولانی تر کرد و از گرجستان گذراند. پروژه عظیم خط لوله باکو تفلیس جیهان با کمک‌های مالی کشورهای غربی مانند آمریکا آغاز شد و در سال 2005 به بهره برداری رسید و روزانه بیش از 1 میلیون بشکه نفت را منتقل می‌کند. احداث این خط لوله نمونه مهم از تأثیر تصمیم‌گیری‌های سیاسی بر پروژه‌های بزرگ عمرانی و اقتصادی است.
What I was trying to describe in the book is the context, and I think there's always inevitably perhaps a focus on the kind of superpower or power politics going on, but my feeling is, and that's why I think human security offers us a very good lens to rethink some of these challenges and these contexts, is not just look at it in terms of the power politics and nations and their interests, but also add in that individual, that human dimension. What's the impact on people on the ground? How is that going to play into their acceptance of, you know, political regimes, of arrangements, of economies? So it's adding that different, if you like, providing a different perspective on a problem that is always going to be, and certainly in that region, you're never going to get rid of power politics. You're never going to get rid of that kind of geopolitical tendency. But I think you can't isolate these things, and you can't isolate it as an economic problem only. But if you look at it from the bottom up, if you look at it from the position of, you know, what do communities need, what's going to be the impact on ordinary people, it gives you another level of understanding. Not to say this is the only one, but it's a different way of viewing what the challenges might be and how you might start about addressing them. So in the chapter on that region and the oil pipelines, the example I took was BP. In its history, BP is a company which has been very integrated with power politics, British power politics, Anglo-Iranian, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. It's the beginning of BP.
So, exactly. So it's no stranger to this kind of high-level strategic kind of practice. However, I think what was really interesting was that they did kind of take the bottom-up, the ground-level perspective as well, and really worked with communities along that pipeline as partly as a way of navigating through the minefield of different competing, you know, strategic interests.
In other words, you can say in one side of the coin is money talks in politics. In other side, you can say every business activity is influenced by politics as well.
Yes, so you can't disentangle them, but I think, and really the whole point of the work I'm doing is to try and get to a better balance in how we understand the role of business in relation to politics and money, you know, business money and business power.
At the conclusion of the book, you were rather more realistic, and you emphasized, I quote, "In the last 2 decades, while we have become more critical of big business, we are also aware that companies are themselves complex ecosystem consisting of customers, employees, unions, suppliers, even governments and civil society partners." Do you think the vast majority of the world people agree in this statement, and that the major global companies are in favor of win-win situation in the current and the future conflict of the world?
I think two changes that I've noticed, particularly even in the last 5 years, is you have a younger generation who is much more ethically minded. They care about what business does. They care as consumers, but also the changes that companies themselves are bringing in are often in order to attract the best new employees, and they realize that they have to behave in a different way. So that's a very powerful driver. I think the other powerful driver is the investment community. In the past, you know, I've talked to companies and they say, well, we can't do this because we still have to deliver short-term returns and our investors won't like it. I think that is completely changing. I think investors are now the ones who are pushing companies to behave in more socially responsible, more socially aware ways. So I think that that opens up that, and we haven't really talked much about the sustainability goals, but that whole conversation around sustainability, which has to do with obviously climate change, but also has to do with growing technological changes in the way we work and live, the artificial intelligence revolution, all these big changes mean that I think the role of business is changing. Companies are aware of that, and I think there is more possibility for win-win solutions.
Speaking about win-win solution, you finished your book with this sentence at the very end of the book: companies and the rest of us too must decide whether a path to peace is one we are ultimately bound to travel together in order to build a safer world. I think this is a very, very important motivation for everyone else. But what do you think about the obstacles of this motto or slogan, if you or wish you have? Do you think it's really possible in midterm? I don't want to say short term, in midterm world.
It's certainly not easy. I mean, the things that we're finding as obstacles or ways of overcoming the obstacles is training and education. It's management education. It's making people aware that if they buy Nike shoes or they buy a deodorant from Unilever or some ice cream, what are the consequences of those consumer choices? But I think, companies, I've looked at a few large, what we call pathfinder corporations, amongst them people like Unilever, a lot of the extractive industries who were very much demonized and quite rightly criticized 10 years ago for the abuses that they committed, actually now are at the forefront of a lot of change. But a lot of the change needs to take place within corporations, how they organize themselves. One of the new developments I rather like is that some companies now in Silicon Valley apparently are appointing what they call chief impact officers, chimpos, to really think about the consequences of business action. So I think the path is there, but it's like with most things, like with climate change, like with sustainability, companies want to know how. Don't just tell me to do these things. How do we do them? And I do believe that you need to start, small at the grassroots with good examples. We're working with lots of companies at the moment who have very interesting social investment programs, and thinking what lessons we can take from those good examples, how you can replicate them is the kind of challenge ahead for us as kind of bystanders and analysts, but clearly for the companies themselves.
But there is a dilemma in this situation. You have companies, big companies, major corporations, that they understand the long-term policies, and almost all of them have strategic officers and scholars and analysts to help them in this way. But from the other hand, you have shareholders. They don't think about long-term solutions. They think about their short-term value of their assets, value of the shares. How do you think they can manage this conflict between short-sighted shareholders and long-term strategists?
I think you're right. Short-termism dominates finance and business, as it does politics and you know, even the social choices we all make. I do think it is changing. I mean, I think what's persuasive for a lot of shareholders and big investors is that the returns that they can get through what's called impact investing or investing ethically, investing with so-called environmental, social and governance targets, not just bottom line financial returns, have been proven to be greater. I mean, up to 8 times greater than traditional investments. So I think the way we organise our societies is slowly changing. Is rather like, you know, turning around a supertanker. This isn't going to happen quickly, and I don't want to overstate the revolution or the evolution that is going on, but so many challenges like climate crisis, like the technological revolution, are forcing us to do this much more quickly than we might have thought about doing before, that actually I remain confident that even though maybe it's only a few pathfinders and they're still acting imperfectly, change is happening.
If I ask you what is your very short, brief message of the book to both public audience and elite audience, what do you say?
I think business can be a force for good in these mega social challenges we now face. They need to be part of the conversation. I think the days are gone when business was somehow, you know, as the French might put it, a domaine réservé, something set aside. I think business and companies and the whole ecosystem of capitalism, if you like, has to be integrated into our social discussions about how we go forward, how do we prosper, how do we survive.
I past that, I go to my last question about what is your current and future research project, if you like to talk about that.
Well, I think I've been interested in my academic career. I've been interested in the idea of peace, what it means in practice to people. How do you create stable and settled communities? How do you protect people from the worst threats and fears that they face? And I think there are different ways of doing that. I'm quite interested in unusual ways, not the traditional, certainly not the armies, not even the individual. Yeah, which was why including the business sector. But I'm also very involved in theatre and the arts, and I think that is a fantastic tool for peace building as well, one that gets overlooked, is starting to be acknowledged by governments and policymakers, but there's so much more to be done, and we've had a couple of events here, discussion panels at LSE on can art build peace and how can it do that. So that's what I would like to also concentrate on in the next few years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.